Hello and welcome to the Crafted Closet. I'm Julie, and today's project I'm super excited about. I have several videos recorded already, but this one's jumping to the front of the line. This is the Violet Field Threads June pattern, and we are playing with stripes. So I'm going to show you how to cut the pattern pieces to be able to make this chevron design on the front, and then we're playing with the direction of the stripes on the skirts. The pockets also have the little chevron detail, and I show you how to add the piping on top. I do make the bow a little different than the pattern calls for because I wanted a nice big bow. Show you how to do the elastic panel, and everything inside is fully enclosed because if you've watched any of my videos, you know that's how I like to sew. So even the elastic panel, all of those seams are fully enclosed. There's no raw edges or serging. Use French seams to finish the side seams of the the skirt. So anything else? Fabrics are from Joann's if I can find them, if they're still available, because I bought the rainbow seersucker last summer. If it's still available, I will link it in the description. So let's get into it. All right, in today's video, we are playing with stripes. So I've got this fun rainbow seersucker. The bubbles are an intentional part of the fabric. The colored lines are woven tighter than the white, and so you get that crinkly effect. For the front bodice, I want to do a chevron effect. So I've added a 1/2 inch seam allowance to the front middle of the bodice. And I'm going to take my, let's put this here so you can see. I'm going to take my quilting ruler, and it has a 45-degree line marked on it. I'm going to line that up with one of the stripes on the fabric. So, once I have that lined up, I am going to butt the edge of my pattern up to the ruler, and that will cause the stripes in the fabric to be at a 45-degree angle to the center front. And then I'll pin in place. And then I can cut this piece out. Yep, that's the right direction. Okay. So now I'm lining up that piece with the stripes so that when I sew them together, they will be in a chevron design. So I'm just going to use this piece, my first bodice piece, as the guide for cutting my second bodice piece. I'm going to make sure that those stripes are lining up. Now I'm going to cut out the second half of the bodice. So now we have our mirrored fronts, and we're going to get this fun chevron on the front when we sew it together. So for the back, I've done the same thing. I've lined it up. I've also done something that's probably a little extra and unnecessary, but I think it's going to look cool. So I've made it so that these side seams, so the front and back side seams, are going to line up and match. So you'll have a chevron going here too. So I'm going to cut this piece out, and then just like I did with the front, I'll flip it over and make sure I'm cutting the mirror image. And the pockets are the last thing I'm going to cut using the chevron technique. So I've traced half of the pocket piece and then added 1/2 inch to what would be the center of the pocket. When I cut the lining, I will fold that back and just cut the lining as an entire single piece. So again, I've lined up my 45-degree mark on my fabric, and I'm going to line up my pattern piece with the edge of the ruler. Let's see. I want the red stripe to meet the corner, so I'm gonna move it so that it does. There's half my pocket. I will cut another one that is a mirror image of that, and then I will cut another set so that I have 2 pockets. So I now have all of my pieces cut out. These are the front and back bodice that we already cut out. I have the elastic casing panel and the elastic pieces cut out based on the pattern. I have my front and back bodice lining, in addition to the pocket pieces that we already cut out. I have the pocket lining, and I'm going to put red piping at the top of the pocket. So I've cut the bias strips for those. They are 1.5 inch wide, and I'm using an 1/8 inch cording for that piping. And then I have my skirt pieces. So the center skirt panel and then the side skirt panels, the pockets get attached over these. So I did the main on the vertical, and then I cut the side panels on the horizontal, and then the back skirt is all just vertical. And then instead of doing the ties that are in the pattern, I am using the sash from the Violet Field Threads Elodie pattern, and I'll link that in the description below. It's just going to give me a much bigger bow than what is called for in the pattern. I'm going to get started by sewing the front bodice center together and the pocket centers together. What I'm doing is lining up my stripes and pinning and making sure that the stripes are perfectly aligned so that when we sew it, they create a perfect little chevron down the center front. And you can pin every single stripe. I think I'm going about every third stripe because these are fairly closely spaced. So I'll do that for the rest of the front of the bodice and for the pocket pieces. Now we're going to sew with a 1/2 inch seam allowance. Somebody was playing with my machine. It's on turtle speed, moving it up to rapid speed. Moving my pins as I get to them. And just be careful when you are pinning the pocket. This edge will be 90 degrees. This one goes out, sorry, this side goes out a little bit further. So make sure you're pinning the straight side and not the angled side. Now I'm going to trim the seam allowance down to probably about 1/8 of an inch and then press the seam open. Now we're going to make the piping for the top of the pocket. So I've got just a little scrap piece of piping cord, and I'm going to fold it inside of the bias strip that I cut and just line up my presser foot against the edge of that piping cord and just sew a straight line. Now I'm going to switch my presser foot to a zipper foot. I'm going to pull the cording right now. Let's see, the cording is right at the edge, and I want a 1/2 inch gap at that edge because I don't want the cording to end up in my seam allowance. So I'm pulling it so that it is 1/2 inch from the edge of the piping. And I'm going to baste it onto the top of the pocket. Now that presser foot will ride right along the edge of the piping. Then I'm going to stop here. I'm going to trim my piping to the correct length. And then I'm going to take out these little basting stitches.
For my pants.
So I can cut 1/2 inch off of the piping cord without cutting my thread. And then I'll finish basting it on.
Wait, what's yarn?
Now that the piping's attached to the main, I'm going to sew the lining in place. I'm going to do it with the main side up so I can see the stitch line that I already sewed, because I want to make sure I'm on that same stitch line so that you don't see the white stitches on the finished product. So just keeping that presser foot right up against the piping again. Switch this back to my normal foot. And I'm going to sew the bottoms of the pockets together.
In the car.
Well, they don't need to go in the car. Now I'm going to trim the seam allowance down to 1/8 of an inch. And then I'm going to flip it right side out. We'll go press it flat. Let's see, can you see the whole thing? There we go. So I just used the white lining so that it wouldn't show through to the front of the rainbow fabric. Now I'm sewing the shoulder seams of the main bodice together. Same with the lining. I'm also going to sew the channels for the elastic casing now, because my fabric has lines on it. I didn't draw the lines in, I just marked with a pin where I needed to sew. The pattern calls for you to mark this first line 3/4 of an inch up from the where the skirt seam will be. But because I want to fully enclose this, I've marked it up 1 inch so that I have room to turn the seam under 1/2 of an inch. So I'm going to start sewing there. I'm just going to follow my line. These other lines are marked according to the pattern. Now I'm going to take a safety pin and feed it into the elastic that's been cut based on the pattern. It'll be different for every size, so no point in me giving you that information. And then I'm going to feed it through the casing that we just made. And then I'm just going to pull it right to the edge of the fabric and sew it in place. Stitch. And then I'll feed it the rest of the way through. Now that I'm at this side, we'll just hold it at that edge and baste it in. And I'll do the same thing with the second casing channel. All right, I've changed out my thread to red. I was gonna avoid doing it, but couldn't bring myself to not change it because I didn't want the white stitches showing through the red. So I'm going to sew around the outside of these sash pieces. And again, I'm using the sash instead of the bow that the pattern calls for the back closure. Now I'm just going to trim off all but 1/8 of an inch of that seam allowance all the way around. All right, now I have it all trimmed up. I've kind of rounded off the corners on the super pointy end, and at these little points I've cut a little notch into that corner. So now we're going to turn them right side out. Before I pull it all the way out, I'm going to grab a little knitting needle and poke out that point. And then I will take it to the ironing board and roll the seams out as much as I can so that that stitch line is right at the edge of the seam, and press everything flat. Now I have my back bodice piece, and I'm going to baste my sash pieces into place. Because I'm not using what the pattern called for, I have placed the sash piece so that it's a little more than 1/2 inch up from the bottom, and then if I angle the ruler this way, it's a little more than 1/2 inch down from the top, and then it is parallel. The edge of this is parallel with the edge of this, and so I'm just going to baste that in place, and then the bow itself will make up for that lost amount of distance. And I've done that on both sides and made sure that they're even. I'm just going to baste them into place before it gets sewn all together so they don't move. To pin the main and the lining together, right sides facing. I'm going to start, I've marked the center of my bodice and the center of my, or the center of my lining and the center of the bodice is already marked because that's where our chevrons meet. And then I'm going to line up the shoulder seams. So I've pressed the shoulder seam on the main towards the back and the shoulder seam on the lining towards the front. And that way those two seams just nest together. And then I'm going to kind of roll up my sash piece inside because we're going to sew all the way around this piece. So line up my corners. These pieces have a notch on the pattern piece where you stop sewing so that we can insert that elastic panel that we made earlier. You just want to make sure all the sash is going to be out of your way when you're sewing it. go ahead and pin the other side the same way. Okay, so I've got it all pinned in place. I've marked 1.5 inches over from this edge. I decided that's where I want my final seam to be, and just so I can see it easier. And I'm going to start sewing. I'm going to backstitch that corner in. Come over to this corner, backstitch. At the shoulder seams, I'll pivot. Okay, I'm gonna check. Yeah, I like how that looks. Make sure I didn't catch anything. And then I will trim. Yeah. Now I'm going to use my pinking shears to trim all of this up, or at least all the curves. So I'm going to leave a little bit down here because we still have to put in the panel.
Neckline, trim with pinking shears.
And this part, I'm going to leave about 1/2 inch here so that there's plenty of the strap still in there. And for this edge, I'm just going to trim to about 1/8 inch, but because it's straight, it doesn't need to be pinked or notched. So I will flip all of that right side out and press. Now that the neckline is all ironed open, we need to close up the armhole before we insert the elastic panel. Otherwise, it will not turn out for you. You have to have a center back opening to be able to close up the armholes like this. So I'm flipping the lining right sides together with the main, and I'm starting at the shoulder seam and pinning those together. And then I'll pin them together along the arm's eye. Yay. And this is where it's going to be a little bit trickier.
Oh.
Recording.
Oh.
It's okay. This all needs to get kind of stuffed in here and be out of the way while you're sewing. Now I'm going to sew at 1/2 inch. Then I'm going to use my pinking shears again to trim the curves. Now I'm adding a safety pin to the bottom corner of the back of the bodice and feeding it through the strap so that I can pull the back to the front. And you just have to go really slowly. Make sure you're not trying to pull too much through that shoulder seam, and just be very careful. Make sure you don't pop any stitches so that you don't have to redo it. It took me a while. This is a very skinny shoulder strap, so just go slowly, take your time. Here's the finished arm's eye. I'm gonna go iron all of that. That's all ironed now. You can see this is just a very small area, and so you just have to be very careful pulling all of that through. Now we're going to close up the underarm seam. So I'm going to take right sides together on the front and back bodices. I'm going to line up the underarm seam. Pin that. Put a pin. Or two on the main. And then this area, I really want to line up those stripes again. So I'm going to make sure my stripes are lining up and pin them together. I'll press those seams open, maybe. I'll probably trim off at least some of the rainbow side, just so it doesn't show through on the front of the fabric. But I'll press them open and then press the rest of the arm's eye together. It lines up. And I got a nice little chevron on the side. So I finished the other armhole the same way as the first. So they're now both finished. Now we're going to insert the elastic panel into the back. So we've got our elastic panel that we made earlier. I'm going to pull the fabric away from the edge so that it's kind of bunched up more towards the center so that this is nice and flat. And I'm going to pin it to the front side, or pin it right sides together with one side of the bodice. That's why we left this open earlier, so that we could insert this panel. And when we sew this time, we're just going to sew up to that 1 inch part. If you wanted to serge your skirt on, you could sew all the way to the end, but this way we're going to leave this part open so that we can put the skirt in there. So then I'm going to take the bodice lining and fold that down and then pin it in place as well. Now that I have that all pinned in, I'm going to start an inch up from the waist seam with my 1/2 inch seam allowance, and I'll back stitch. This is, let's see, there's the top of the panel, so I'm going to come and back stitch right there too, just to give it some extra security. And then I'm going to sew up to where we stopped earlier when we did the whole neckline. Make sure everything's laying nice and flat, and then back stitch there. And then to finish this off, I'm going to open up and sew this portion at 1/2 inch. Just up to that seam. And then I'll fold this part that's against the lining down and do the same. So I'm just going in right at that seam line. Now back stitch there and then finish that off. So from the outside and the inside it's fully finished, but here these are not attached, so that when we attach the skirt seam, this can fold up, and then we can fold the lining down and top stitch it in place, and the skirt will be caught in between there and it'll be fully finished. So I got the bodice finished yesterday afternoon, and I tried it on my daughter, and I realized that these bows are kind of ridiculously large for an everyday thing. It could still be really fun for like a party dress or something, but I think they're too big, so I'm going to make them smaller. And to do that, I'm going to stick my thumb in there and kind of pull this out. And then I can unpick just this bit, pull out the I'll pull out the existing bows or sash pieces and remake them smaller, and then can put them back in the same way. So everything's still fully enclosed, but not quite so big. So I'm going to get this ripped out and then redo the sashes. So now I've got the sash out and I've recut it. So it's about 24.5 inches long from this end to the tip. And I cut it 4.5 inches wide so that my finished bow will be 3.5 inches wide. So I'll resew this just like I did before and then show you how I'm going to reattach them. I have my remade sash piece. I'm going to put a safety pin in just to help me feed it through. And then I'm going to feed it back up through where we took it out a little while ago.
And then I'll line it up. Put it in place. And put that back.
Now, so I'm gonna sew part of the seam that's still in place just to make sure that it's still, just to reinforce that a little bit. Come down to that corner, put my needle down a little bit just to make sure that that stitch catches. Back stitch. Now we have reattached sash. So you could also, if you didn't want to worry about all the bulk of the bow inside while you're doing the arm seam, you could leave this seam open when you're first sewing the neckline and always put the bow in later. So here I have my daughter modeling the bodice. This is the front, and I'm going to have her turn around and move her hair out of the way. And this is what the new bow looks like, not quite as comically large as the previous one. And then I'm going to show you what the elastic panel looks like on her. And we'll go finish the skirt. All right, I've pinned the pockets to the skirt side panels according to the instructions in the pattern for placement. So I'm lining up the edge of my presser foot, my 1/8 inch presser foot, with the edge of the pocket. And I'm going to top stitch along here. I'm also going to up my stitch length to a 3 just because I like it to look better. That's what that looks like. And then because of my fabric having this funky wrinkle, the pockets are a little wider at the bottom than the side panel piece, so I'm gonna sew from the wrong side to sew those in place so that I'm lining it up with the edge of the panel. Trim off this little bit of excess down here. Now the pocket's attached to the side panel. So I'll do the same thing on the other side panel. Now that the pockets are basted in place, I'm going to French seam the 4 skirt seams. I'm going to throw a couple pins in here just because I'm lining up the straight of grain with the cross grain, and I just want to make sure everything kind of sews together nicely. I've got wrong sides together. I'll sew at 1/4 of an inch. Take that back down to 2.5 for my stitch length. Now I will trim the seam to 1/8 of an inch and then press it so that that seam is folded inside and the right sides are facing each other. So I now have the seam pressed so that they are right sides together, and I'm going to sew from the, I'm going to sew with the vertical lines facing up just so that I can keep a nice even line along the verticals because that'll be more noticeable. And again, I'm sewing at 1/4 of an inch to finish this French seam. At the top of the pocket, I'm going to backstitch there just to give it a little more reinforcement. Bottom of the pocket. Here's that seam finished. I'll sew the other 3 seams on the skirt the same way. Now that I've finished all the vertical skirt seam, French seams, I've ironed all of them away from the pocket panel, and I've pressed the hem up 1/2 inch and then folded another 1/2 inch. I'm going to sew the hem. I'm going to line up the edge of the fold with the left side of my presser foot. I'm going to put my stitch length at a 3 and just sew all the way around, being careful when I go over these French seams because it's a lot of bulk. Back stitch to finish. Now we're going to sew 2 rows of gathering stitches. So I'm pulling tails out. Sorry. I've found one of my side seams. So I'm going to start with the edge of my fabric 3/16 of an inch away from the needle. That's also 5 millimeters if you're metric. And I'm going to up my stitch length to a 4 and sew all the way around the skirt. Get back around to where I started. I'm going to stop my needle before I go over those basting threads again, and then pull out tails, cut them off, and then I'll sew another row of basting stitches at 1 centimeter or 3/8 of an inch. Now I'm going to mark my registration marks on the skirt. So I've lined up my side seams and pulled straight so that I can find the center point of the back, and I'll mark that with a notch. Then I will fold the center to the side seams, pull that tight, and mark the quarter points with a notch. I'm going to pull this one out because I'm sure that wasn't very deep, so I'll recut that notch. And then I'll do the same on the front. So, still have my side seams lined up. There's my front center. And then my front quarters. For the registration marks on the bottom, the front center is already marked because that's where our chevron seam is. So I'm going to fold center to side seam and mark the quarter point on the front. To find the back center, I'm going to line up the seams where we inserted the elastic panels, and then I'm just going to slowly walk this off to get to the center point. when we're attaching the skirt to the elastic panel, we're going to attach it with this piece of fabric laying straight so that this still has the full stretch, because if you kind of bunched it up, you wouldn't be able to stretch this anymore. It would be stuck at the length that it was when you sewed it if it was not stretched out. And then for the quarter marks on the back, I'm just going to use this seam line to represent a quarter. To gather the skirt, I've found my top stitching threads from the gathering threads that we sewed. Whew. I'm going to just tie a little knot there just to keep them in place. Maybe. There we go. So that's just to hold everything in place. And then I'm going to go to the back of the skirt and grab the bobbin threads, and I'll pull the bobbin threads to gather up the skirt. And then I will just pull the fabric along those threads. So I'll continue to do this until the skirt is the same width as the bodice. So I have my skirt gathered up now. I'm going to start pinning in place at the center. So I found the center notch on my skirt and the center notch on the bodice. And I'm going to pin those in place. And then I have my quarter notches. I will pin those in place. And then I will spread the gathers evenly between those notches and add in a few more pins. And we'll do that all the way around the bodice. When you're working on the back elastic panel, you want to make sure that you're pulling, or you're just pinning to the front panel, and that you've got the lining part out of the way. And then also you're lining up your gathers along the full width of this panel piece, not what it looks like when it's all gathered in because of the elastic. So the gathers on this area are quite a bit further apart than the rest of the skirt. Okay, I've got the skirt all pinned in, so now we're going to sew it in place. Going back to my 2.5 length stitch. And I pull my gathers as I sew out to the side so that they are perpendicular to the seam line. And this is the part where the elastic panel is. So I'm just going to make sure I go slowly and that I have that piece completely flat and the lining piece completely out of the way as I sew through. skirt's attached, the last thing to do is to enclose this waist seam, and we'll do that by folding the lining under 1/2 inch and pinning it right at that stitch line that we just used to attach the skirt. And you want to make sure that everything's laying nice and flat. When we get to this back elastic panel, make sure that's in. The skirt gets folded up in, and then this folds under 1/2 inch and again gets pinned in place. Then I've got the center of this panel and the center that we marked for before for installing the skirt. So I'm going to fold that under 1/2 inch and make sure that lines up. And then I'll just keep folding the skirt in and then stretching it so that I can line up this little tiny lining panel with the main or the front of the elastic panel. So I just want to make sure that's all laying nice and flat as I pin it in, so that when we top stitch from the outside, the inside ends up with a nice finish. So the lining is all pinned down now, and I'm going to stick it under the machine. Actually, I'm going to turn the garment inside out. And I'm going to start one of my side seams. I'm going to line up the edge of the bodice with the edge of my presser foot, switch my stitch length to a 3, and then top stitch, and this top stitch will catch the lining as I go and fully enclose that seam. And I can reach under here and pull out pins as I go as well. I'm getting to the elastic panel, so I just want to pull out or hold the section that I'm doing taut as I go. I'm only trying to make sure that the section that's currently going under the needle is nice and flat. I'm not worried about the rest of it. That's the inside of the elastic panel. So you can see the top stitching, and it's all enclosed. And then the front. So everything just gets nicely enclosed. Now I'm going to show you how you tie the bow. You bring the right side over, and then left side over top of the right, and then under and up onto the wearer's right shoulder. Then you take the sash piece and make a loop with that. Bring the other sash piece around and push it up through here to make the other loop. Pull it up. To tighten up the knot, you pull on the front of this left loop and then just play with the loops and the ties until you get the look you want. And here's the finished dress. Thank you so much for watching The Crafted Closet. Please like and subscribe if you enjoyed the video.